Right, let's talk about zooms versus primes for wedding photography. I'm Martin Castein. I've shot nearly 400 weddings, and what I want to do with my channel is try and pass on some of the upsides and downsides of wedding photography and make sure that you don't make mistakes along the way whilst you're learning and becoming a better wedding photographer. Now, when it comes to using zooms and primes, I have a few opinions on this. Firstly, you need to understand that a lot of the times when people are telling you that they're shooting a 35 and an 85, when they say that that's their system and that's what they use, that's usually not their entire system. Usually they've got other lenses in their bag, which they might not use on a regular basis, but they are there as a backup because you can become stuck at weddings. You can really come undone if you aren't careful. I'll give you some examples, right? I've shot a church wedding where it was pouring down outside and there was over 100 people attending the wedding. And they wanted a picture, not just of their family, but one with everyone in it. You are not achieving that on a 35mm lens or a 24mm lens. You're going to need a wide angle zoom for that. And I had one, so I managed to get the shot. I've also had times when I've been doing ceremonies where I've been in a church and the priest has said to me, you need to stand at the back and you can't come past this line. And 200mm was barely enough to get the job done. And for that reason, I needed a 70-200 as well. And I think it's really important that you kind of get the idea that when photographers say that they use a 35 and 85 or a 24-70 and 70-200, they usually have other lenses that go around that as well. And a good wedding photography kit, to my mind, is going to be a mix of primes and zooms. There's some things you really need to be aware of as differences in terms of actually doing the job on the day between primes and zooms. There's upsides and downsides to both. And I'm not going to go into the light gathering of primes. You'll know all of that stuff. So one of the things that's really nice about using prime lenses at a wedding is that you really know what the focal length is when you pick up that camera. You're going to get 35mm, for example, and when it comes up, it's very predictable. You feel like you're in the right place, and because you're using it constantly, you keep your distance to the subject correct most of the time. The problem comes in when you need to zoom with your feet, because zooming with your feet at a wedding can work and it can be dangerous. For instance, you don't want to back into the cake. Now that's not very likely to happen, but what about if you back into a group of guests who are having drinks in their hands and you smack into them? What if you back into a child and trip over them and knock them over and you fall over as well? These things can easily happen. What happens with prime lenses is that if you're not an experienced wedding photographer, you can end up having a much harder time being in the right place, because the key to using primes really well is to be able to anticipate the moment well. Once you've shot a few weddings, that becomes much easier to do. So I always recommend to wedding photographers that are starting out that they have a mid-range zoom, like a 24-70 2.8, or maybe a 28-75 2.8, one of those Tamron lenses, something like that. But that you have a mid-range zoom when you're getting started, because you won't be able to anticipate everything that's happening and the moment is gone. Like if you find yourself in the wrong place with the prime lens and you need to back up, you will need to look over your shoulder and take a step backwards. And the moment's gone at that point. You haven't built that anticipation up from experience to understand when something like that's going to happen, where you need to move to get into the right place. So 24-70 will cover you for that. But when it comes to a 24-70, that has its own downsides as well. And the most common one that people run into is that when they pull the camera up to their face, you just don't know what focal length you're going to get. So I'll cover this in a minute because I have the workaround for that. But not knowing where the focal length is, for instance, let's say you used the lens at 70mm when you just took a picture a moment ago, and then you turn around, you bring it up to your face, and because of the intensity of weddings on the day, this kind of, oh, I'm at 70mm and I know that I'm going to be, it doesn't really stick very well in your mind. So if you bring the lens and the camera up to your face and it's a focal length you're not expecting, you'll be like, oh, I need to zoom out. And you zoom out and then you try to zoom to frame, which is another problem with zoom lenses as well, is you try to just get this framing. The moment's gone because it takes the time again. Like as if you're trying to zoom with your feet, you lose that. So the way to get around it is I get into a habit, because you need to practice these things. If I'm using a 24-70, I'll always set it to 35mm until it becomes habit. So I'll zoom, take a picture, do what I want, and then I'll just twist back to 35 and put it down again. And so what I'm doing is I'm training myself at 35mm focal length. So if I do switch to a prime lens at 35, that feels very natural at that point. And then I would have a 35mm prime, like a 1.8, as a backup to the 24-70, because we'll speak about that in a moment. So the zoom lens can slow you down because you're trying to frame and you're trying to get it just right. And with weddings, the thing that you're trying to build all the time, the thing that you're trying to work on, is getting that experience and being able to observe what's happening, that you're putting yourself in the right place before that thing happens. And it takes time to get to that. And that's why I think that zooms are better until you feel like you've kind of got that. And at that point, it's up to you whether you switch to primes or not. And I don't have any particular opinion on whether primes are better than zooms or not. You'll feel you'll gravitate more towards one or the other. But I think you should start off with a zoom lens, because it's like it's always going to be your get out of jail card, because you can just deal with more when you're in the wrong place. Okay, so when you're starting out, a zoom lens is a more sensible option, but you need to have a prime lens with you, because the thing that we need to speak about is your gear will break. I had on my 24-70 the motor die. The focus motor died on me just as the ceremony was starting, right at the start. And I knew how to manually focus to get some shots until I switched over to my 50. And that was just enough time that you need to register these things quickly. So this is understanding with your lenses. You need to do things like practice. How do you manual focus with your lens? With a 2.8, you can do it, but you need to be able to practice a little bit, and then you need to be in that position. So when we talk about using lenses and what you have, for me, a 50 is always there in my bag or a pocket in my suit. It's always on me. A 50 1.8 is always there because I can get shots with it, right? So if my 24-70, when it died, I had no hesitation. I grabbed a couple of shots, because it was at that moment, when the bride and the groom, they come together and they do this thing where they look at each other, and they've got this, there's kind of like, there's this meeting, they've come together and they glance at each other a few times. And it was at that moment that my 24-70 died. And you get this sort of ice cold feeling run through you as you just realize it's like you work it out almost immediately, because you're that switched on a wedding day. Couple of shots, and when I manual focused it, because it was pretty much in place already, but I could tell it wasn't working, it's lens off, into the bag, 50 on, keep shooting. And this is the thing, you need to have backups to things. So if you get to the point where you're doing the 35 and 85 thing, if you do that, you've got to have a backup for those, because especially for the 35, because you're going to shoot probably most of the wedding day on that. If that 35 is dead, it's really good if you've got your old 24-70 in your bag, right? That's why when you get these things, don't sell them, keep them, because they become your backup. So if you start from 24-70 and your 35 dies in the ceremony, your 24-70 should be in your bag there. So you should be able to take that 35 off that's dead, stick it in your bag, 24-70 on, and that's your old 24-70 that you are familiar with because you used to shoot on it, and you can carry on shooting the wedding like that. Now, that makes a little bit more sense, right? So when you're building up, let's talk about lens selections. What type of lenses should you go for? The way I see it is nowadays, with the way lenses are, I wouldn't have any problem using like the Tamron type of lenses, those 2.8s, if that helps you build your kit and that helps you get there faster because it's more financially accessible to you. I would absolutely go down that road. I would have no hesitation using that 35 to 150, the f2 to 2.8. That looks fantastic because you're getting then you wouldn't need the 70 to 200 either, because you're getting the telephoto ends, you're getting the sort of the 85mm and the 35 and the 70-200 all into one lens. You're getting all of that, and just have something wider to go with alongside that as well. So when you get those wider shots, like the 17 to 28, and then I'd probably still end up getting the 35 and 85 1.8 primes to go with a setup like that. That's probably the kind of thing that I'd go for, because it's very tempting with all of this camera gear to say, I'm going to buy the most expensive thing out there, I'm going to get but it's not necessarily the best thing, because some of these focal length changes, some of these manufacturers have brought out, like these 35 to 150s, are really, really practical for doing weddings on. But sometimes, you want something different, or maybe you want to gravitate more towards primes for a lighter weight setup. Some people are older that are getting into weddings now wanting to do these things. So a prime lens can make more sense, and maybe you get some of those 2.8 Tamron zooms or whatever to go along with it, so you make up this kit that makes sense to you. But what you should be able to do is, you should really be able to shoot a wedding on primes or zooms based on the kind of gear that you've got. You should have enough to cover most of those situations, but having a flexible kit like that will just get you out of so many situations. Like, you can have speeches that you shoot, for example, where you just need a long telephoto zoom lens. It just makes life so much easier because the tables are all crowded, and they do this thing where you can look at where the wedding breakfast is. And then what happens is when the speeches start, everyone turns their chairs around and it blocks off all of the paths going in and out. And at some places, so I know some people like to hover around the top table and be near the bride and groom. That doesn't necessarily give you the best pictures always. It just depends. And you can end up stuck at the sides, moving around a little bit so you get audience reactions better like that. And then zooming into whoever's talking, giving a speech. You just need a long lens at some places in order to do this. So you need to think dynamically like that. I think something that I see people trying to do all the time is that they want to make the cheapest, most minimal kit possible. And I would say to you, don't shoot a wedding until you've got something more than that. Because you need to always be in this mindset of what happens if this breaks. Because if you've only got a 35 and 85 and your 35 breaks, you're done. You've got your backup camera body, but you haven't got the backup lens, and you're trying to shoot the wedding reception like later on an 85. Good luck with that, you know. It's going to be really, really difficult. And just simply adding a 28 to 75 or 24 to 70 to that setup would have been game changing and made life much easier for you. Yeah, that would have made things so much simpler. And so sometimes even when we're shooting the ceremonies as well, a zoom lens can just be better. Like a 24 to 70 could just be better, because you can end up, if you're at the front, it can be that when they come to the front, the bride and groom, they're much closer than you thought they were going to be. Sometimes they just walk up a bit further, and you need that 24mm range in order to get it. You just have to have it. You know, it's just not an option. So these are the things you need to think about. This, like, what if this, what if that? The more flexibility you have in your kit, the better. And the 1.8 primes is where I would head towards for the prime lens part of it. Because the 1.4s and so on, to me, a wedding, it's like, yes, when you're further down the line, you might want to add those things. I just personally don't think that it adds enough over the 1.8. They're much more expensive, and they just don't really give you a lot more in the context of a wedding, because you need to remember, and we need to sort of take stock of this slightly, that people want to see where they are. It's no good constantly blurring out all of the backgrounds all the time to the point where, you know, you can't tell where someone's going to be. There's a little story that I tell people, which I'll just tell you guys quickly, because it was something that I saw online. So there was this photographer that went to, I think, Japan, and he took an 85mm 1.2, I believe. And when he showed his friends the pictures, they were like, you could just be anywhere, man. This just isn't, like, where are you? There's no indication that you're in Japan. And this is such a really relevant point when it comes to lenses and fast lenses. And I know that when you're getting to the wider angles like 35, you can still see the background and make it out. But I personally think that when you're in that f2 kind of range, that's about right for a wedding, in terms of you don't need to go any wider than that with an aperture. I think you're not adding much, and you're potentially taking things away slightly, because they want to see where they got married. You need to always think, I always tell people that want to do weddings, that imagine that you could travel back in time and shoot your parents' wedding. Imagine that you could do that. And what gear would you take to do that? Because you would want to record everything, wouldn't you? You'd want to be able to really see the place where they got married and understand the context of it all and the people that were there. You wouldn't want, I'm blurring out the background, doesn't look dreamy. That's for photographers. Yeah, and that's not for people. Wedding photography is about people. It's a social type of documentary work. It's a social photography, if you like, wedding photography, because this is very much about families and people and how they're connected to each other. So you need to bear this in mind when you're doing weddings. It's not about you and your blurry backgrounds. And I have nothing against fast lenses. I use them myself. I have 1.2 glass and all that kind of stuff too. But it fits in certain contexts at certain times. And you can absolutely make those lenses work for you as well, those faster lenses at weddings if you want to, but you need to know what you're doing. You have to understand how and when shooting at 1.2 will still show the background and make it look beautiful. I'm telling you, it takes time. If you're new to wedding photography, keep it simple. Get those 2.8 zooms and 1.8 primes. Don't go beyond that, because by the time you can and you know what you're doing, you're not going to need my advice anymore. You're going to be at that point where you can just go ahead and just do it, okay? But when you're starting, keep this stuff simple. Go for the cheaper 2.8 zoom lenses if it saves you money. Go for those 1.8 primes. Now, this video, I hope you found this useful, and if you did, can you please drop me a comment and give me a like? Give me some encouragement. Let me know that this was useful for you, and then I'll want to carry on making more videos, and it helps me with the algorithm for YouTube as well. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel and drop me a comment to let me know how that was. I'd also like to get some ideas from you of videos you'd like me to make. Yeah, tell me what the sort of things you'd like to see from me, and I'll try and make that content for you as well. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Okay, take care. Bye bye.